The silver moon hung low over the abandoned space station of Sector 7. Once, this place was full of life, but now, it was a graveyard of cold metal and broken dreams. Smoke rose from the jagged remains of a crashed royal transport ship. Silence covered the hallways like a heavy blanket, but for Queen Xylara, the silence was more terrifying than any scream. She was the powerful ruler of the insectoid empire, a race known for their strength and cold logic. But tonight, she was not a queen. She was a mother. Her two young daughters, the only heirs to her throne, were missing in this dark, metallic labyrinth. Queen Xylara moved through the shadows with her 4 elite guards. Their glowing red eyes searched every corner. The queen's heart pounded against her chest plates. They had been searching for hours since the crash. The station was infested with shadow crawlers, vicious, multi-legged predators that hunted anything that breathed. Xylara gripped her pulse blade tightly. Her mind was filled with dark thoughts. She feared that her daughters had already become a meal for the beasts that lived in the dark. As they turned into a narrow corridor, the lead guard stopped suddenly. He pointed his weapon at the floor. There, lying in a pool of dark green blood, was a shadow crawler. But it wasn't just dead, it had been destroyed. Its thick armor was cracked open by what looked like a massive, blunt force. Its neck was twisted in a way that no animal could manage. Xylara felt a chill run down her spine. What kind of monster could kill a shadow crawler with its bare hands? She looked further down the hall. There were more bodies. 3, 5, 10 predators lay dead, forming a path of carnage toward the lower decks. "Stay alert," Xylara whispered, her voice trembling. "Something is here. Something much more dangerous than the crawlers." She imagined a giant, mindless beast roaming the halls, perhaps holding her daughters in its claws. The thought made her move faster, ignoring the safety warnings of her guards. They reached the entrance of the main engine room. The heavy blast doors were dented, covered in deep scratches. It looked like a dozen predators had tried to break inside, but they had failed. Then, they heard it. It wasn't a scream, and it wasn't a roar. It was a low, rhythmic sound. It was a soft humming vibration. To Xylara's ears, it sounded like a ghost calling from the darkness. It was eerie and strange. She had never heard a sound like this in the entire galaxy. Her guards raised their rifles, their fingers trembling on the triggers. The humming was coming from behind the dented door. The mystery of what lay inside was suffocating. Xylara signaled her guards. One of them placed a small explosive on the lock. With a loud bang, the door creaked open. The queen was the first to rush inside, her blade glowing with deadly blue light. The room was dim, lit only by the flickering emergency lights. The smell of copper and sweat filled the air. In the center of the room, sitting against a large metal crate, was a shadow. It was tall, wide, and looked like a mountain of muscle. The figure turned its head slowly. The light hit its face, revealing a human. Xylara had heard stories of humans, a primitive race from a small blue planet. They were supposed to be weak and soft. But the man in front of her looked like a demon. His face was covered in dirt and dried blood. His shirt was torn to pieces, revealing skin covered in deep scratches and bruises. His knuckles were raw and red. In his right hand, he clutched a heavy metal pipe, stained with the blood of the predators they had seen outside. Xylara felt a wave of rage. This human was covered in blood. She was sure he had killed her children. She raised her sword, her eyes burning with hatred. She was ready to strike him down and take her revenge. The human's eyes were tired, heavy with exhaustion, but he didn't look afraid. He didn't move to attack. He didn't even try to stand up. He just sat there, staring at the queen with a look that she couldn't understand. Just as Xylara stepped forward to deliver the final blow, the human moved his left arm. He slowly pulled back a thick, dirty leather jacket that was wrapped around his chest. Xylara froze. Her breath caught in her throat. There, tucked safely against the human's warm chest, were her two daughters. They were not hurt. They were not crying. They were curled up in small balls, their tiny hands gripping the human's tattered shirt. They were fast asleep, comforted by the very humming sound that had terrified the queen. The human looked up at the queen, who was shaking with shock and confusion. He didn't say a word about his pain or the small army of monsters he had fought off alone. He simply placed a single, blood-stained finger over his lips. "Shoo," the human whispered softly. They finally fell asleep. Xylara's sword dropped inches from the human's head. She realized that the monster she was hunting was the only reason her children were still breathing. The most dangerous creature in the room wasn't a predator, it was the man who had turned himself into a shield. Queen Xylara stood frozen, her pulse blade still humming in her hand. The sight before her made no sense. In the history of the galaxy, different species did not help each other unless there was a profit. Her own kind, the insectoids, lived by logic and survival. Yet, here was a human, a species her advisors called weak and emotional, bleeding from a dozen wounds just to keep two alien children warm. Her elite guards remained in a combat stance, their weapons pointed at the human's head. They saw a threat, but Xylara saw something she had never encountered before, a soul that cared more for others than for itself. The human, whose name was Elias, did not look at the guns. He did not look at the glowing swords. His eyes were fixed on the two little girls sleeping in his lap. Every time he breathed, a sharp pain shot through his ribs, but he kept his chest steady so he wouldn't wake them. One of the guards stepped forward, his metal boots clanking loudly on the floor. The human's eyes snapped toward the guard, a sudden flash of fire in his gaze. He didn't speak, but the look on his face said everything. He was a tired dog protecting his pack, and he was ready to bite. As Xylara watched him, she noticed the marks on the walls. The engine room was a fortress. The human had used heavy metal scraps to block the ventilation shafts. He had used his own jacket to plug the gaps under the door so the cold air wouldn't get in. He had turned a cold, industrial room into a nursery. Xylara deactivated her blade. She signaled her guards to lower their weapons. "Wait," she commanded in her clicking language. "He is not our enemy. Look at his hands." The guards looked. The human's fingers were torn, his nails broken from clawing at the metal to save the princesses. To understand how this happened, Xylara looked at the broken security monitor on the wall. It played a grainy, silent recording of the last 3 hours. The video showed the moment of the crash. The royal pod had slammed into the station, and the shadow crawlers had arrived almost instantly. They were monsters of teeth and shadow. The princesses were trapped inside the burning pod, screaming for help. That's when the human appeared. He wasn't a soldier. He was a scavenger, a man who lived in the vents of the station, hiding from the world. He could have stayed hidden. He could have let the monsters eat. But on the screen, Xylara saw the human run toward the danger. He didn't have a pulse rifle or armor. He only had a heavy wrench and a desperate heart. He fought the first crawler with such fury that the beast backed away in confusion. He pulled the princesses from the wreckage just as the engines exploded. The video showed him carrying the two girls under his arms, running through the dark corridors while a dozen predators chased him. He wasn't faster than them, but he was smarter. He led them through narrow pipes where they got stuck, and he used his own body as a door to block the path. In one horrifying scene on the monitor, a predator had jumped on his back. Its long claws sank into the human's shoulders. Xylara gasped as she saw the human reach back, grab the monster's head, and slam it into a wall until it stopped moving. He didn't stop to check his wounds. He didn't cry out in pain. He only looked down at the two little girls to make sure they hadn't seen the blood. He picked them up and kept moving until he reached this engine room. He had been fighting for 3 hours straight without a single moment of rest. Back in the present, the princesses began to stir. The oldest daughter, Princess Xylara, opened her golden eyes. She didn't scream when she saw her mother. Instead, she looked up at the human's bruised face and reached out a tiny hand to touch his cheek. She chirped a soft sound of comfort. The human smiled, a weak, tired smile, and let out a long breath. It was as if he had been holding his life together with pure willpower, and now that the mother was here, he could finally let go. The guards moved in to take the children, but the princesses clung to the human's tattered shirt. They didn't want to leave their protector. The human tried to stand up to hand them over, but his legs gave out. He collapsed back against the crate, his face turning pale. Xylara rushed forward, not to attack, but to catch him. She felt the heat radiating from his body. Humans were so warm, so full of life. She realized then that his weakness, his emotions, was actually his greatest weapon. It gave him the strength to do the impossible. But the moment of peace was shattered. A deep, vibrating roar echoed through the station's walls. The shadow crawler queen, a monster the size of a tank, had found them. She was angry that her pack had been killed. The walls of the engine room began to groan under the weight of something massive climbing on the outside. The guards turned their guns toward the ceiling, but they were shaking. They knew their weapons wouldn't be enough for a queen crawler. Elias, despite his broken ribs and blood loss, gripped his metal pipe once more. He looked at Xylara and pointed toward a small escape hatch in the floor. "Go," he whispered in his simple English. "Take them. I stay." He knew he couldn't run anymore, but he was willing to be the bait one last time. Xylara looked at the man who had saved her world, and for the first time in her life, she felt a tear roll down her cheek. She was the queen of 1,000 worlds, but she was standing in the shadow of a giant. The metal ceiling above them groaned as if the entire station was screaming in pain. The shadow crawler queen was not like the others. She was a mountain of black chitin and glowing purple eyes, and her weight was crushing the very room they stood in. Dust and sparks fell from the flickering lights. Queen Xylara gripped her daughters tightly, her heart cold with fear. She was a warrior, and her guards were the best in the empire, but they were all exhausted. They looked at the ceiling with eyes that saw only death. But when Xylara looked at the human, she saw something different. Elias wasn't looking at the ceiling with fear, he was looking at it with a strange, quiet fury. Elias pushed himself off the cold floor. His legs shook, and his breath came in ragged gasps, but he stood tall. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, dented metal cylinder, a simple flare. He looked at the alien queen and pointed toward the escape hatch again. His voice was gravelly and low. "Go now," he said, his English simple but firm. "I make a path. You run. Don't look back." Xylara wanted to argue. She wanted to tell him that a single human could not stop a monster that had destroyed tanks. But she saw the look in his eyes. It was a human madness, a survival instinct that ignored logic and focused only on the mission. Suddenly, the ceiling exploded. A massive, sharp leg, as thick as a tree trunk, stabbed through the metal and nearly crushed a guard. The shadow crawler queen roared, a sound that vibrated in their very bones. The roof peeled back like paper, revealing the terrifying face of the beast. Her many eyes fixed on the small princesses. She lunged forward, her mandibles snapping. But before she could reach them, a bright, blinding red light filled the room. Elias had ignited the flare. He didn't throw it, he ran straight at the monster, waving the burning fire in its face. The monster shrieked in pain. Its eyes were built for the darkness of deep space, and the human's flare was like a sun exploding in its face. The beast backed away, thrashing its heavy legs. Elias didn't stop. He climbed over the debris, his movements blurred by a rush of adrenaline. In the alien world, soldiers fought until they were hurt. But humans were different. When a human was hurt and protecting something they loved, their brain unlocked a secret power. Their heart pumped faster, their muscles ignored the pain, and they became something more than biological. Xylara watched in awe as this weak scavenger jumped onto the monster's head, stabbing his metal pipe into one of its glowing eyes. The room became a whirlwind of violence. The shadow crawler queen slammed Elias against the wall, and the sound of breaking bones echoed in the room. Xylara screamed, thinking it was the end. But to her horror and amazement, the human didn't stay down. He coughed up blood, wiped his mouth, and stood up again. He picked up a heavy power cable that had fallen from the ceiling. It was sparking with thousands of volts of electricity. He looked at Xylara one last time and shouted, "Run." He wasn't asking anymore. He was commanding a queen. Xylara realized that if she stayed, his sacrifice would be for nothing. She grabbed her daughters and signaled her guards to retreat into the hatch. As she lowered herself into the dark tunnel, she looked up. She saw Elias wrap the sparking cable around his own arm to get a better grip. He dived toward the monster's open mouth, the electricity dancing across his skin. He was using himself as a conductor to deliver a killing blow. There was a massive explosion of white light and a roar so loud it felt like the station was breaking apart. The doors of the hatch slammed shut, cutting off the sound. Inside the narrow escape tunnel, the silence was deafening. The princesses were crying now, calling out for the warm man who had held them in the dark. Xylara hugged them, her own body trembling. She had always been taught that humans were a minor species, a footnote in the history of the stars. But she had just seen a man challenge a god of the dark with nothing but a piece of pipe and a flare. She didn't know if he was alive. No one could survive that kind of explosion. She felt a deep ache in her chest, a grief she usually only felt for her own kind. They crawled through the tunnels for what felt like hours until they reached the outer docking bays. Xylara's rescue fleet had finally arrived. Hundreds of high-tech ships filled the sky, and thousands of soldiers landed on the station. They were ready for war, but the war was already over. The station was quiet. The shadow crawlers were fleeing, terrified by something that had happened in the engine room. Xylara stood on the landing pad, her daughters safe in the arms of the royal doctors. She looked back at the smoking ruins of the station. "Find him," she whispered to her general. "Find the human. Do not return until you do." Inside the narrow escape tunnel, the silence was deafening. The princesses were crying now, calling out for the warm man who had held them in the dark. Xylara hugged them, her own body trembling. She had always been taught that humans were a minor species, a footnote in the history of the stars. But she had just seen a man challenge a god of the dark with nothing but a piece of pipe and a flare. She didn't know if he was alive. No one could survive that kind of explosion. She felt a deep ache in her chest, a grief she usually only felt for her own kind. They crawled through the tunnels for what felt like hours until they reached the outer docking bays. Xylara's rescue fleet had finally arrived. Hundreds of high-tech ships filled the sky, and thousands of soldiers landed on the station. They were ready for war, but the war was already over. The station was quiet. The shadow crawlers were fleeing, terrified by something that had happened in the engine room. Xylara stood on the landing pad, her daughters safe in the arms of the royal doctors. She looked back at the smoking ruins of the station. "Find him," she whispered to her general. "Find the human. Do not return until you do." The rescue mission was not just a search, it was a race against time. The space station was falling apart. Debris fell from the ceiling like iron rain, and the air was thin and freezing. Queen Xylara refused to board her royal ship. She stood on the bridge of the station, her eyes fixed on the smoke-filled corridor leading to the engine room. Her best soldiers, armored in high-tech plates, were afraid to go back inside. They had seen the destruction. They had heard the explosion that had rocked the entire sector. They were certain that nothing, not even a god, could have survived that blast. But Xylara remembered the human's eyes. She remembered the way he looked at her daughters. "Go," she screamed at her generals. "He did not die for you to be cowards. Find him. A team of 12 elite scouts finally entered the engine room. What they found was a scene of pure nightmare. The shadow crawler queen, a beast that had lived for centuries, was dead. Her massive body was charred and broken, fused to the floor by the sheer power of the electric blast. The room smelled of ozone and burnt metal. In the center of the room, there was a mountain of rubble. The scouts began to dig. They expected to find a crushed body, but as they moved the heavy metal plates, they heard a sound. It was faint, almost impossible to hear, but it was there. Thump, thump, thump. It was a heartbeat. It was loud and steady, like a drum in the silence. They pulled away the last piece of debris, and there he was. Elias was curled in a ball, his body covered in soot and blood. His clothes were almost gone, and his skin was burnt. But his hand was still gripped tightly around that metal pipe. He was unconscious, but his body refused to stop fighting. The royal medics rushed him to the Queen's ship. They had never treated a human before. When they hooked him up to their machines, they were horrified. His bones are broken in 5 places, the head medic whispered to the Queen. His skin is burnt, and he has inhaled smoke that would kill any of us. By all laws of biology, he should be dead. The medic pointed to a screen showing Elias's brain activity. But his mind, it is still in combat mode. Even while asleep, his body is producing chemicals to keep him alive. He is literally refusing to die. Xylara sat by his bed for 3 days. She watched as the human's body began to heal at an incredible speed. She saw her daughters sneak into the medical bay every night. They didn't want toys or sweets, they just wanted to sit near Elias. They felt safe near him. They would curl up on the edge of his bed, just as they had done on the floor of the station. The guards, who once looked at humans with disgust, now stood at attention whenever they passed his door. They had started calling him the Iron Ghost. On the 4th day, Elias opened his eyes. He didn't scream in pain. He didn't ask where he was. He looked around the clean, white medical room with confusion. When his eyes landed on Xylara, he tried to sit up, but he groaned as his ribs reminded him of the battle. Xylara stepped forward and gently placed her hand on his shoulder, a sign of ultimate respect in her culture. "The girls are safe," she said in his language, which she had worked hard to learn. "You saved my blood. You saved my heart." Elias looked at the 2 little princesses sleeping in the chairs next to him. A small, tired smile touched his lips. "Good," he whispered. "That's all that matters." He didn't ask for a reward. He didn't ask for a medal. He just closed his eyes and drifted back into a peaceful sleep. For the first time in his life, the scavenger didn't have to look over his shoulder. He was under the protection of the most powerful empire in the galaxy. The story of the human on the station spread like wildfire across the stars. Other alien races, who had once ignored or bullied human colonies, suddenly became very quiet. They saw the footage from the station. They saw a lone, unarmed human take down a shadow crawler queen to protect children that weren't even his own species. They realized that humans were not just simple primates. They were a race of protectors who carried a fire in their souls that could burn down a galaxy if provoked. Queen Xylara issued a new royal decree. From that day forward, any ship carrying the human flag was to be treated as a friend of the empire. She built a statue of Elias in the center of her capital city, not as a warrior with a gun, but as a man sitting against a crate, protecting 2 children. The inscription at the bottom was simple, using the words Elias had told her. It said, "They are safe with us. Because a human showed us how to love." The galaxy was a big, dark place, but as long as humans were around, the darkness would always have something to fear.